Welcome back to Tim's Garage. I'm finally getting to the point that I'm ready to install the turbo, and a couple of things I wanted to go through before I start that process of installing the turbo were a couple of concerns. The first one was I had one of the individuals who was looking at my videos indicate that I should really pull the heat shield off of the exhaust manifold and just check the torque on the exhaust manifold bolts, and sure enough he was right. I had 4 of the bolts on the exhaust manifold that were very loose, not even 5 pounds of torque, and they are to be torqued to about 10 pounds. So I went through and retorqued all the bolts, and finding 4 or 5 of those bolts that are far more loose than they should be is a bit of a problem. So since you've got it all apart and you're putting the turbo on, definitely undo the 3 bolts on the heat shield, and that's a pretty straightforward piece. I'll show an image of that. And then make sure you torque the bolts to the factory spec, and I believe that spec is 10 pounds, but I'll include both an image of the torque spec and the sequence in which you need to torque them in an image in the video. Now, once we've got that all torqued and put back together, reinstalling the heat shield, a couple of other things that I did is I went through the process of replacing the motor mounts. And the reason I chose to replace the motor mounts is the factory mounts are extremely soft and flexible. As you can see, these mounts, they have a lot of deflection in them, so they'll provide wonderful drive quality, but as you add horsepower, it would allow the engine to really twist over in the vehicle. So instead, I went to, I believe it's called Kappa Haus, and I managed to get some fabricated neoprene bushed motor mounts from Brian Cooper, and I'll show an image. Of those mounts from Brian Cooper that I have installed. I haven't had a chance to actually try them out yet. I understand they're gonna, put a little bit more vibration into the car, but it'll prevent the engine from moving in the chassis. And that's important. From what I understand, as you start to add horsepower to these cars, you can break the mount at the back of the transmission if the engine is allowed to rotate too much. So by putting these firmer mounts in, it'll allow for the power to be transferred a lot more solidly into the chassis and less deflection at the back of the transmission. The last thing in prepping for my install was that we had to deal with the gaskets. And the replacement gasket that replaces this gasket is slightly different, and apparently this gasket has become obsolete. The replacement gasket has a slightly larger hole in the center, and it's shaped a little bit differently around the outside edge of the gasket. It's nothing to be concerned about. It'll completely swap in place of the other gasket. But I did wind up having to trim a little bit of the corner of the bottom of the gasket down here. I just didn't want to take a chance on it rubbing or chafing any of the heat shielding that's around the tubes, the coolant and oil line tubes that are at the bottom. So I managed to do that. So I got all of that done, and it looks like now I'm going to be able to move on to installing the turbo. Okay, so I'm ready to install the turbo, and I've got a couple of things. Trying to organize all of this into one operation is sometimes hard when you're trying to communicate that to other people. So what I've done is I've got the oil tube has now been torqued to spec and installed on the bottom of the turbo, and this is the oil return tube. The turbo sits mounted like this, and that is the drain that drains down into the oil pan for the engine. I need to insert this point into the cavity in the engine that you can see. If you come around here and look, right down here with the screwdriver, you can see there's a hole right down there. You got to come further back out. You can't see it where you're at.
There it is.
Okay, there it is. Okay, so that's the hole I need to drop the tube into. Then additionally, I need to make sure that I get the turbo slipped over these 4 studs. I've already installed the replacement gasket, which has been a superseded gasket part number. So come on out and I'll go ahead and start to install the turbo into that location. Hopefully it goes really well and easy. You're going to take it and insert it past all of the cooling lines. Trying to do this one-handed is a little bit of a challenge. Okay, so I'm going to get that tube down into where it needs to go, which is not that easy. Okay, so I'm gonna start some nuts on here and see if I can get it to stay snugged up. I've got to get the oil line to press all the way into the oil pan, or to the block where it slides in, or the oil pan. The oil drain needs to slide all the way in. Having a little trouble holding it all and not having somebody helping from underneath to insert that. So we'll just do this up as much as I can from the top. Then I'll go down below and I'll make sure I get that oil pipe all the way in there and pressed in so that the O-ring seals exactly as it should. I replaced that O-ring in it. There's a much tighter seat than the one that was in there prior. Okay. Let's see if I can reach this underneath. Boy, getting these bolts is extremely difficult from the top. My guess is it may be a little bit easier from underneath. Okay, I've got that nut started. All right, so I've got it somewhat mounted up here, although I don't believe that I've got the oil line fully seated. Okay, there we go. And then this line needs to come up, mount to there, around this tube right here. Okay. Looks like it's gonna actuate perfectly into there. All right, let me see if I can get the last nut in. But we got it all done. So it looks like it's installed. A couple of points that we have to make note of if you come in closer. A couple of things that are pretty important are the routing of the coolant lines. So it's important to note that this lower coolant line, this one that's located right here, runs on the outside of the shaft from this diaphragm that works the blow-off valve that's internal within the actual turbocharger housing itself. So it has an internal wastegate that's built in, and this actuator rod that runs along this waste to actuate that wastegate from the vacuum pot that's right here. We have to make sure that this particular line, here, let me move this out of the way so you can see it. This coolant line right here that has the shaft that runs all the way down has to run on the outside of this shaft to make sure that it has clearance and everything. Other than that, I think we've got a pretty good, it's pretty well set up, and it's all ready. I'm excited. Just got to do up the bolts. One last one to go. Okay, now that I have the turbo completely installed and bolted up and affixed to the exhaust manifold, now I need to install the catalytic converter assembly. And when I was disassembling this, and this car only had 8,500 miles on it, but somebody had put exhaust on it and had managed to cross-thread a couple of the nuts, and in taking it apart, I wound up breaking or destroying the factory studs that go into the catalytic converter that hold the exhaust up at the bottom of the catalytic converter. So what I did is I went and ordered replacement studs, and I installed those into here, and I installed those using the typical double nut method, where you thread a nut onto the stud, And then you thread a second nut onto that stud. And you have the ability, when you tighten these against each other, to thread this stud in, for those people that are not familiar with this. Or you can use a really slim 15mm wrench, which I didn't happen to have. So the double nut method, where you tighten the nuts against each other and then use the outer nut to thread the stud in, is the preferred way to do it in this case, if you don't have a slim 15mm wrench. I also installed a new donut gasket on the bottom. But these studs, the part number for these studs to replace them is this part number right here. It's 125-62640. And when I ordered them, it looked like these were the same for Corvettes and for Camaros and a bunch of other vehicles, but there was limited quantities available, and they were kind of pricey. I think they're about $10 for each bolt. But I wanted to put it back together with the factory type bolts. The other thing that I need to do is I had to make a decision between the two different styles of gaskets that I could use, or compression gaskets. There's the factory GM crushable ring gasket, or you can use a crushable dead soft copper gasket. And I think I'm going to be running with the factory gasket, inserting it into the ring here, and then torquing this back down to factory specs in order to put it all back together. But the other acceptable way to do this would be to use the copper gasket. I believe that's the way it goes. You could use the copper gasket as well, and it would seal up just fine. But I prefer to use the GM crush gasket. That's what it used from the factory, and I think it's going to be just fine. So I'll go through the process of installing this, and as you may recall, to install this back on the vehicle, you have to raise up the passenger side of the engine. And when you go to install this in the bottom, it has to kind of go up like this. If I'm facing the front of the car this way, this has to move up like this. And then, as I recall, it had to turn sideways, move up, and then rotate like this into the catalytic converter as you mount it up into the catalytic converter. And I'll have to go back and look, and if I need to redo that portion of the video, I'll do that when I go like this. Okay, so it's all rotated up there. Now, I just need to put the ring gasket in there. Okay, so we're going to slide the ring into here, clip it into a little slot, and then bring this up and slide it over top of the studs, bumping into this. I'll just throw a couple of nuts on here to hold this up so it can't fall off again. You slip it onto the studs, you use the nuts, torque it down to 37 pound-feet, and you're good. All right, thank you very much for watching. I look forward to coming back after I've got everything installed and giving you a look at the catalytic converter, the turbo, and all of the cooling lines installed. Thanks for watching. Please like and share, and subscribe if you haven't already.